Most novelists try to tell you what happened. Kazuo Ishiguro does something much stranger. He tells you what someone thinks happened. At first, that doesn't seem like much of a difference. But then, somewhere in the middle of one of his novels, something shifts. You suddenly realize you have been trusting a narrator who isn't exactly lying to you. They're lying to themselves. And somehow, that's even more unsettling. The first time I noticed this, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Not because I discovered some clever writing trick, but because it made me wonder, how often do I do the same thing? How often I tell myself stories that make the past easier to live with. And that's what makes Ishiguro so fascinating. Almost all of his novels follow the same pattern. One is about an elderly butler looking back on his career. Another follows a woman remembering post-war Japan. Another begins with a group of children who slowly discover why they exist. Another follows an old couple searching for memories they have lost. Completely different roles, different characters, different genres. Yet, they're all haunted by the same question. How much of our past is actually real? And how much of it has been quietly rewritten over the years? That question turned Kazuo Ishiguro into one of the most celebrated novelists of our time and eventually earned him the Nobel Prize in Literature. But honestly, the Nobel Prize isn't what interests me. What interests me is how he creates stories that stay with people for years, even though almost nothing dramatic seems to happen. There are no huge action scenes, very few villains, sometimes not even a clear conflict. Instead, he lets something much quieter happen. His characters slowly discover the truth about themselves, and sometimes they never fully do. Because Ishiguro isn't really writing about England, or Japan, or history, or science fiction. He is writing about something every one of us does almost every day. We edit our memories. People often describe Ishiguro as a Japanese writer, which is true. He was born in Nagasaki in 1954, but there's one small detail that changes everything. When he was 5 years old, his family moved to England. The move wasn't supposed to be permanent. His parents believed they would eventually return to Japan. They never did. I keep thinking about what that must have felt like. Imagine growing up hearing stories about your homeland without really knowing it yourself. Your version of that place wouldn't come from experience. It would come from conversations around the dinner table, from old photographs, from nostalgia. Years later, Ishiguro realized something that would shape almost everything he wrote. Memory isn't a recording, it's a reconstruction. Every time we remember something, we change it a bit. We forget certain details. We accidentally invent others. Sometimes we make ourselves look kinder than we were. Sometimes we make ourselves look more innocent. And the strange part is, we usually don't realize we're doing it. The more I thought about that idea, the harder it became to ignore in my own life. Have you ever remembered an argument only for the other person to tell the exact same story completely differently? Or looked back on a decision and convinced yourself it was inevitable, even though at the time you had no idea what you were doing? Maybe memory isn't there just to tell us what happened. Maybe it's there to help us keep going. That idea became the heart of Ishiguro's novels. At first glance, they seem to be about history. World War II, post-war England, ancient Britain, even a dystopian future. But those are really just settings. The real subject is memory, because history only happens once. Memory keeps happening for the rest of your life. Take the remains of the day. On paper, it sounds painfully boring. It's about an elderly English butler looking back on his career. That's it. Yet many people consider it one of the greatest novels of the 20th century. Why? Because the narrator never fully understands his own story. As he remembers his life, little cracks begin to appear, things he avoids thinking about, moments he explains away a little too quickly, regrets hidden behind professionalism. Slowly, you begin realizing something before he does. He's spent decades protecting himself from a truth that's simply too painful to face. That's classic Ishiguro. His characters usually aren't trying to fool the reader. They're trying to protect themselves. And honestly, I think we have all done that. Not in huge, dramatic ways, but in small ones. We tell ourselves we didn't really care about that relationship, that losing that opportunity didn't matter, that we're over something we're obviously not over. Sometimes those stories help us survive. Sometimes they stop us from growing. The same thing happens in Never Let Me Go. It begins like a quiet coming-of-age story. Nothing seems particularly strange, but little by little, tiny details stop making sense. The students feel unusually isolated. The teachers avoid certain questions. Nobody talks much about the future. Ishiguro never rushes to explain what's happening. He trusts your curiosity. He lets you slowly put the pieces together yourself. And by the time you finally understand the truth, it's already too late to protect yourself emotionally. That's what makes his books so powerful. They don't shock you, they quietly change the way you have been looking at the story all along. Reading Ishiguro sometimes reminds me of remembering a dream. Not because his stories are confusing, because they feel emotionally familiar. You know those dreams where everyone else seems to understand what's happening, except you? Where something important is just out of reach. That's exactly how many of his novels feel. And it's completely intentional. Ishiguro has said that he isn't trying to recreate reality perfectly. He's trying to recreate emotional reality. The feeling of regret, the feeling of remembering, the feeling that maybe your entire life changed because of one decision you barely noticed at the time. That's why he leaves so many questions unanswered. Another writer might explain every mystery. Ishiguro doesn't. He leaves space for uncertainty. Some readers hate that. Others never forget it. Maybe because real life doesn't explain itself either. Most of us never get perfect closure. We don't always know why relationships end, why certain friendships slowly disappear, why we become completely different people from the ones we imagined we'd be. Eventually, all we have are memories, and memories aren't nearly as reliable as we'd like to believe. When Kazuo Ishiguro won the Nobel Prize in Literature in 2017, the Swedish Academy said his novels reveal the abyss beneath our illusory sense of connection with the world. That's a beautiful sentence. It's also a very confusing one. Here's how I understand it. Ishiguro writes about the stories we tell ourselves so we can keep living. The loyal servant who can't admit he wasted his life. The young girl who slowly realizes her future was decided long before she was born. The old man whose memories become impossible to separate from guilt. Different people, different lives. The same question. How much truth can a person actually live with? What I love most is that Ishiguro never judges his characters. He understands why they protect themselves. And honestly, most of us do exactly the same thing. We rewrite old arguments. We remember failures differently. We convince ourselves certain choices were unavoidable. Memory isn't just a history book, it's also a survival mechanism. Maybe that's why Ishiguro's novels stay with people for so long. You start reading about someone else's memories. Then, almost without noticing, you began questioning your own. Maybe that's his greatest achievement. He doesn't just change the way you read fiction, he changes the way you look at yourself. And once that idea settles into your mind, it's surprisingly difficult to forget.